The Theresa Hotel occupied the northwest corner of 7th Avenue and 125th Street in Harlem, a 13-story building that had opened in 1913 as one of the few hotels in New York City that accepted black guests during the era of segregation. By October 1964, the Theresa had become a landmark of Harlem's commercial and social life, known for hosting prominent visitors and serving as a venue for important meetings related to Harlem's business and political affairs. The hotel's lobby featured dark wood paneling, marble floors, and brass fixtures that conveyed an atmosphere of formal respectability despite the building's aging infrastructure. On the afternoon of October 14, 1964, at approximately 3 o'clock, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson arrived at the Theresa Hotel for a meeting that had been arranged through intermediaries over the previous week. Johnson was 58 years old, having been released from Alcatraz 15 months earlier after serving 11 years of a 15-year sentence for drug conspiracy. Since his return to Harlem in August 1963, Johnson had been working to reassert control over the criminal operations he had managed before his imprisonment. Johnson wore a charcoal gray suit with a white shirt and dark tie, his appearance reflecting the careful attention to dress that had characterized his public presentation throughout his career. The meeting concerned the future of a commercial property at the corner of Lenox Avenue and 132nd Street that had housed various businesses over the years and was currently being offered for sale by its owner, who was retiring and moving out of New York. The property consisted of a 3-story building with street-level retail space and residential apartments on the upper floors. The ground floor had most recently operated as a social club that served as a front for gambling operations, making the property particularly valuable to anyone seeking to establish or maintain control over Harlem's illegal gambling business. The property's owner had decided to sell rather than continue managing the building, and word had spread through Harlem's business community that several parties were interested in purchasing it. For Johnson, acquiring this property would consolidate his control over gambling operations in a strategically important section of Harlem and would demonstrate that he had successfully rebuilt the financial resources and organizational capacity necessary to make significant investments. The property represented both practical value and symbolic importance in Johnson's effort to reestablish his position after more than a decade away. Johnson took the elevator to the hotel's 3rd floor, where a conference room had been reserved for the meeting. When Johnson entered the room, he found that several people had already arrived. The property owner, Marcus Hendricks, who was a 72-year-old man who had owned the building for 30 years and who had maintained generally cooperative relationships with the various figures who had operated gambling businesses on his premises. Hendricks sat at the head of a long table with his attorney beside him. Also present were 3 men Johnson did not recognize. They were introduced as representatives of a Brooklyn-based syndicate that controlled gambling operations in several neighborhoods and was seeking to expand into Harlem. The leader of the group identified himself as Anthony Carbone, a well-dressed man in his mid-40s who spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. Carbone explained that his organization had substantial financial resources and was prepared to make a competitive offer for the property. The meeting began with Hendricks explaining that he wanted to conduct the sale professionally and fairly, and that he had invited multiple interested parties to submit their best offers. Hendricks stated that he would consider all offers and would make his decision based primarily on the purchase price, though he also wanted assurance that the buyer could complete the transaction promptly and would maintain the property responsibly. Carbone spoke first, presenting his syndicate's offer. Carbone stated that his organization was prepared to pay $60,000 for the property, with payment to be made in cash within 30 days of agreement. Carbone emphasized that his syndicate had extensive experience managing similar properties in Brooklyn and had the resources to handle any necessary improvements or modifications. Carbone also mentioned that his organization had relationships with various suppliers and contractors that would facilitate efficient management of the building's operations. When Carbone finished presenting his offer, Hendricks turned to Johnson and asked what offer Johnson was prepared to make. Johnson stated calmly that he was prepared to pay $55,000 for the property, with payment to be arranged within 45 days. Johnson explained that this amount represented fair market value for the building based on comparable properties in Harlem and on the property's current condition and income potential. Carbone responded immediately, and stating that his offer of $60,000 was clearly superior and that Johnson's lower bid demonstrated either insufficient resources or insufficient seriousness about acquiring the property. Carbone suggested that Johnson should withdraw from consideration rather than waste everyone's time with an offer that could not compete with what Carbone's syndicate was willing to pay. Carbone added that Brooklyn organizations had financial strength that Harlem operators could not match, and that Hendricks would be making a mistake to accept a lower offer from someone whose ability to complete the purchase was questionable. Hendricks looked uncomfortable with Carbone's dismissive tone, but said nothing. Hendricks' attorney asked Johnson whether he wished to revise his offer in light of Carbone's higher bid. Johnson replied that his offer of $55,000 represented what he believed the property was worth and what he was prepared to pay. Johnson stated that he respected Hendricks's right to accept whichever offer he preferred, and that if Hendricks chose to accept Carbone's higher bid, Johnson would understand that decision. Carbone leaned back in his chair with an expression of satisfaction, stating that the matter seemed to be settled. Carbone told Hendricks that his organization would prepare the necessary documentation and would have the cash ready within the time frame promised. Carbone glanced at Johnson and remarked that while Johnson might have controlled Harlem in earlier years, times had changed during Johnson's prison sentence, and newer organizations with greater resources were now positioned to take over operations that Johnson could no longer afford to maintain. Johnson listened to these comments without visible reaction. His face remained calm and neutral, showing neither anger nor concern. When Carbone finished speaking, Johnson simply nodded slightly, stood from his chair, and thanked Hendricks for the opportunity to submit an offer. Johnson stated that he appreciated Hendricks' fair handling of the process and wished him well in finalizing the sale. Johnson then walked to the door, left the conference room, and took the elevator back to the lobby. As Johnson walked out of the Theresa Hotel onto 7th Avenue, his outward demeanor remained completely composed. He walked at his usual measured pace, acknowledged a few people he encountered with brief nods, and gave no indication that anything significant had occurred. But Johnson's mind was already working through what had happened in the meeting and what strategic response the situation required. The immediate problem was clear. Carbone's syndicate had offered $5,000 more than Johnson was willing to pay, and Hendricks would almost certainly accept the higher offer unless some factor intervened to change his calculation. Johnson could potentially match or exceed Carbone's bid, but doing so would mean paying more than Johnson believed the property was worth, and would demonstrate that Johnson could be pressured into overpaying through simple competitive bidding. More fundamentally, if Brooklyn syndicates could outbid Johnson for valuable Harlem properties, they would establish precedent that Johnson's control of Harlem was vulnerable to outside organizations with greater financial resources. But as Johnson thought through the situation more carefully, he recognized that the problem was not primarily about the $5,000 difference in the bids. The deeper issue was that Carbone had publicly dismissed Johnson's position, had characterized Johnson as someone with insufficient resources to compete, and had suggested that Johnson's era of control had ended. Carbone had treated Johnson not as a serious competitor to be respected, but as someone whose bid could be brushed aside through superior financial capacity. This dismissal, conducted in front of Hendricks and his attorney, was designed to establish that Johnson operated from weakness rather than strength. And Johnson understood that Carbone's dismissal was based on incomplete information. Carbone saw the surface elements: Johnson's lower bid, Johnson's recent release from prison, the general assumption that extended incarceration would have disrupted Johnson's financial resources. What Carbone did not see, and what Johnson had not revealed during the meeting, was the web of financial relationships Johnson had maintained and rebuilt over his career, relationships that gave Johnson leverage that extended far beyond the cash he was prepared to offer for this particular property. Over the following 2 days, Johnson investigated Carbone and his Brooklyn Syndicate more thoroughly. Johnson spoke with associates who had connections in Brooklyn, with people who tracked movements of various criminal organizations, and with individuals who understood the financial structures of gambling operations in different New York neighborhoods. What Johnson learned was illuminating and created the foundation for a strategic response. Carbone's Brooklyn Syndicate was indeed financially substantial, controlling gambling operations in several neighborhoods and generating significant revenue. But the syndicate's expansion plans required capital that exceeded its immediate reserves, and Carbone had been borrowing money from various sources to fund acquisitions and to pay for protection and political relationships that allowed operations to continue. Some of this borrowing had come from conventional sources within organized crime networks. Other syndicates, established financial operators, and individuals with capital to lend at the high interest rates that criminal enterprises typically paid. But Johnson's investigation revealed something more specific and strategically valuable. One of Carbone's significant debts was owed to Samuel Morrison, a Harlem-based businessman who operated various lending operations that served both legitimate and criminal borrowers. Morrison had lent Carbone's syndicate $12,000 18 months earlier to help finance the syndicate's takeover of gambling operations in a contested Brooklyn neighborhood. The loan carried interest at 5% monthly, a rate of 60% annually, and was structured with payment terms that required Carbone to make regular interest payments while maintaining the principal balance until the syndicate was ready to pay the full amount. Well, what made this information strategically valuable was that Samuel Morrison had his own financial relationship with Johnson. Morrison had borrowed money from Johnson on several occasions over the years, sometimes for Morrison's legitimate business ventures, and sometimes to cover shortfalls in Morrison's lending operations when borrowers defaulted or when Morrison needed capital to make new loans. Currently, Morrison owed Johnson approximately $8,000 from loans Johnson had extended over the past year since Johnson's release from prison. These loans had helped Morrison maintain his operations during a period when several large borrowers had defaulted, creating liquidity problems for Morrison's lending business. More significantly, one of Morrison's loans from Johnson was secured by Morrison's agreement to assign certain of Morrison's receivables to Johnson if Morrison was unable to repay. This assignment provision meant that if Morrison defaulted on his obligation to Johnson, Johnson would acquire Morrison's rights to collect on specific loans Morrison had made to other borrowers. Carbone's $12,000 debt to Morrison was one of the loans covered by this assignment provision. Johnson recognized immediately that this financial relationship created leverage that Carbone had not anticipated and that changed the competitive dynamics around the property purchase fundamentally. If Johnson acquired Morrison's loan to Carbone through the assignment provision, Johnson would become Carbone's creditor for $12,000. This creditor position would give Johnson significant influence over Carbone's strategic options, including Carbone's ability to complete the property purchase. Over the following week, Johnson developed a strategic approach that would convert this financial leverage into practical control over the property acquisition. The first step was ensuring that Johnson actually acquired the debt. Johnson met with Morrison on October 19th at Morrison's office on 145th Street. Johnson explained to Morrison that the time had come to settle Morrison's outstanding obligations to Johnson, and that Johnson was prepared to accept either cash repayment of the $8,000 Morrison owed or acceptance of the receivables assignment that Morrison had agreed to when the loans were made. Morrison acknowledged that he did not currently have $8,000 available in cash to repay Johnson. Morrison's lending operations had been profitable overall, but recent defaults and the need to maintain capital for new loans meant that Morrison's liquid assets were limited. Morrison asked Johnson whether he would be willing to accept partial payment or to extend the repayment deadline for several more months until Morrison's financial position improved. Johnson replied that he preferred to accept the receivables assignment rather than waiting for cash repayment. Johnson explained that acquiring Morrison's rights to collect on certain outstanding loans would provide Johnson with assets that had clear value and would settle Morrison's obligation definitively. Morrison understood that the assignment would include Morrison's loan to Carbone, and Morrison recognized that Johnson had strategic reasons for wanting to acquire that particular debt. But Morrison also recognized that he had agreed to the assignment provision and that Johnson was entitled to enforce it. Morrison signed the necessary documentation, transferring his rights to collect on several loans, including the $12,000 loan to Carbone to Johnson. With this assignment completed, Johnson now held Carbone's debt. Carbone owed $12,000 to Johnson rather than to Morrison, though Carbone did not yet know about the assignment. The debt carried the same 5% monthly interest rate and the same payment terms and giving Johnson the legal right to demand payment and to take enforcement action if payment was not made. More importantly, Johnson now had a creditor's leverage over Carbone that could be used to influence Carbone's behavior and strategic decisions. The second step in Johnson's strategy involved communicating to Carbone that the debt ownership had changed, and that Johnson was now in a position to affect whether Carbone could complete the property purchase. Johnson needed to convey this information in ways that would compel Carbone to negotiate rather than simply proceeding with the purchase as planned. Johnson arranged for this communication to occur through carefully chosen intermediaries who would make the implications clear. Johnson enlisted the assistance of three key figures who could help execute this strategy. At the first was Eleanor Washington, an attorney who had represented Johnson on various matters over the years, and who understood how debt collection worked legally and practically. Washington was 60 years old, a skilled negotiator who could communicate complex financial and legal information in ways that were both precise and strategically effective. Washington would be responsible for notifying Carbone officially that Johnson had acquired the debt and for explaining what rights Johnson now possessed as Carbone's creditor. The second key ally was Thomas Chen, an accountant who maintained detailed financial records and who could calculate exactly what Carbone owed when interest payments and other charges were included. Chen was 55 years old, someone who had worked with various Harlem businesses and who understood how to document financial obligations in ways that would withstand scrutiny. Chen would prepare the accounting that showed Carbone's current debt balance and payment obligations. The third critical figure was Reverend James Caldwell, a minister at a prominent Harlem church who maintained relationships with various community leaders and business figures. Caldwell was 68 years old, someone who had navigated Harlem's complex social and economic landscape for 4 decades, and who could communicate with Carbone's representatives in ways that combined moral authority with practical understanding of how disputes could be resolved. Caldwell would serve as an intermediary who could convey that Johnson was prepared to use the debt leverage but preferred to reach negotiated resolution. With these allies in place, Johnson implemented the strategy in stages. On October 23rd, Washington sent a formal letter to Carbone notifying him that Morrison had assigned the $12,000 loan to Johnson and that Johnson was now the creditor to whom Carbone owed payment. The letter explained that under the assignment, Johnson had acquired all of Morrison's rights, including the right to demand payment, the right to charge the agreed interest rate, and the right to take enforcement action if payment was not made according to the loan's terms. Washington's letter was professional and legally precise, establishing Johnson's position clearly while not yet making any specific demands. Carbone received this letter on October 24th and immediately recognized the strategic implications. The letter transformed the competitive situation around the property purchase. Carbone's syndicate had offered $60,000 for the property and had promised to complete the purchase within 30 days. But if Johnson demanded immediate payment of the $12,000 Carbone owed, Carbone would need to allocate resources to satisfy that debt, rather than using all available capital for the property purchase. More fundamentally, Johnson's position as Carbone's creditor meant that Johnson could potentially disrupt Carbone's operations through aggressive debt collection if Carbone proceeded with actions that Johnson opposed. Over the following days, Carbone consulted with his own advisors about how to respond. Carbone's attorney reviewed the assignment documents and confirmed that the transfer of the debt to Johnson appeared to be legally valid. Morrison had the right to assign the loan under the original lending agreement, and Morrison had followed the proper procedures in transferring his rights to Johnson. Carbone could potentially challenge the assignment in court, but such challenges were difficult to win and would take time that would likely prevent Carbone from completing the property purchase within the promised time frame. Carbone also investigated Johnson's reputation and history, seeking to understand whether Johnson was likely to use the debt aggressively or whether Johnson might be willing to negotiate some accommodation. What Carbone learned was that Johnson was known for strategic sophistication and for using leverage carefully rather than simply exercising maximum power at every opportunity. Johnson's track record suggested he valued stable arrangements that served long-term interests over short-term victories that created ongoing conflict. On October 28th, Reverend Caldwell contacted one of Carbone's associates and indicated that Johnson was open to discussing how the debt situation and the property purchase might be resolved in ways that addressed both parties' interests. Caldwell explained that Johnson recognized Carbone's syndicate had made a legitimate offer for the property, but that the debt relationship created complications that needed to be addressed. Caldwell suggested that a meeting between Johnson and Carbone could explore whether there was a path forward that would work for everyone involved. Carbone understood that this communication was an invitation to negotiate from a position where Johnson held significant leverage. Carbone could refuse to meet with Johnson and could attempt to proceed with the property purchase despite the debt complications, but doing so would likely result in Johnson using the debt aggressively to disrupt Carbone's operations. Alternatively, Carbone could engage with Johnson to explore what Johnson wanted and whether an arrangement could be reached that would satisfy Johnson while allowing Carbone's syndicate to save face and maintain its business interests. After consulting with his advisors, Carbone agreed to meet with Johnson. The meeting was arranged for November 2nd at a neutral location, a private room at a restaurant on the boundary between Harlem and the Bronx, a setting that belonged to neither party's primary territory. Johnson arrived accompanied only by Eleanor Washington, while Carbone came with one advisor. The meeting began with Washington presenting the accounting that Chen had prepared, showing that Carbone currently owed $12,000 in principal plus accumulated interest that brought the total obligation to approximately $12,800. Washington explained that under the loan agreement, Johnson had the right to demand payment of this full amount immediately, and that if payment was not made, Johnson could take enforcement action, including seizing assets, disrupting operations, or taking other measures to collect what was owed. Carbone acknowledged the debt, but stated that his syndicate did not currently have $12,800 available in liquid assets to pay the full amount immediately. Carbone explained that much of the syndicate's capital was committed to the property purchase and to maintaining ongoing operations. Carbone stated that he could begin making regular payments toward the debt, but that paying the full amount immediately would be impossible without abandoning the property acquisition. Johnson listened to this explanation without visible reaction. When Carbone finished, Johnson stated calmly that he understood the syndicate's financial constraints. Johnson explained that he was not primarily interested in forcing immediate payment of the debt, if doing so would create hardship. Rather, Johnson wanted to reach an understanding about the property acquisition and about how future interactions between Johnson's operations and Carbone's syndicate would be managed. Johnson proposed the following arrangement. Carbone would withdraw his offer to purchase the property, acknowledging that Johnson's offer would be accepted by Hendricks. In exchange, Johnson would restructure the debt obligation to make repayment more manageable for Carbone. Specifically, Johnson would extend the repayment period by 1 year, would reduce the monthly interest rate from 5% to 3%, and would not take any enforcement action as long as Carbone made regular monthly interest payments and remained current on the modified terms. Additionally, Johnson would provide Carbone with an option. If Carbone completed the interest payments for 12 consecutive months without default, Johnson would forgive $2,000 of the principal, reducing the amount Carbone ultimately owed from $12,800 to $10,800. This proposal created a clear choice for Carbone. If Carbone accepted the arrangement, he would withdraw from competition for the Harlem property, but would receive substantially better terms on his debt repayment. The reduced interest rate would save Carbone approximately $250 monthly in interest charges, and the potential principal reduction of $2,000 represented additional savings if Carbone maintained consistent payments. The extended repayment period would give Carbone more time to generate the resources needed to pay off the debt while maintaining his syndicate's operations. If Carbone refused the arrangement and attempted to proceed with the property purchase, Johnson would demand immediate payment of the full debt and would take aggressive enforcement action to collect. Such action would disrupt Carbone's operations, would likely prevent Carbone from completing the property purchase anyway, since he would need to allocate resources to dealing with Johnson's collection efforts, and would create ongoing conflict that would be costly for both parties. Carbone asked for time to consult with his advisors. Johnson agreed to give Carbone 48 hours to decide. The meeting concluded with Washington providing Carbone with written documentation of the proposed terms, making clear exactly what Carbone was being offered and what would be required for Carbone to accept. Over the following 2 days, Carbone weighed his options. The strategic calculation was difficult. Carbone had publicly committed to purchasing the property and had characterized his syndicate as having superior financial resources compared to Johnson's operations. Withdrawing from the purchase would represent a loss of face and would acknowledge that Johnson maintained greater leverage in Harlem than Carbone had recognized. But proceeding with the purchase while facing aggressive debt collection from Johnson would be even more damaging, potentially threatening the syndicate's operations and creating conflict that could escalate beyond the immediate property dispute. Carbone's advisors counseled that accepting Johnson's proposal was the pragmatic choice. The debt restructuring offered real financial benefits, and withdrawing from one property purchase in Harlem was less costly than engaging in extended conflict with someone who controlled significant resources in the area and who had demonstrated sophisticated strategic thinking. Carbone could maintain his operations in Brooklyn and could seek expansion opportunities in other areas without needing to establish presence in territory where Johnson had demonstrated he could exercise decisive leverage. On November 4th, Carbone contacted Washington and accepted Johnson's proposal. Carbone formally withdrew his offer to purchase the property and signed documentation agreeing to the restructured debt terms. Washington notified Hendricks that the Brooklyn Syndicate had withdrawn from consideration, leaving Johnson as the only remaining serious bidder. On November 6th, Hendricks accepted Johnson's offer of $55,000 for the property. The sale was finalized by December 1st, 1964, with Johnson taking ownership of the building and immediately resuming gambling operations in the ground floor space. The resolution of this situation produced several immediate effects. Johnson had acquired a strategically valuable property for $5,000 less than Carbone had been willing to pay, demonstrating efficient use of resources rather than winning through outbidding. More significantly, Johnson had demonstrated that his control of Harlem was based on capabilities beyond simple financial resources. Johnson's network of relationships, his access to information about competitors' vulnerabilities, and his strategic use of financial leverage created power that could not be overcome by organizations with greater apparent capital. For Carbone, the outcome established clear boundaries. Carbone's syndicate would continue operating in Brooklyn without attempting to expand into Harlem. The debt relationship with Johnson would continue for the restructured repayment period, creating ongoing connection that served as reminder of Johnson's capacity to affect Carbone's operations. Carbone made his monthly interest payments consistently, and after 12 months of current payments, Johnson fulfilled his commitment to forgive $2,000 of principal. The debt was fully repaid by November 1966, at which point the formal relationship between Johnson and Carbone ended, though both parties remembered the lessons of how the property dispute had been resolved. The episode influenced how other criminal organizations approached potential expansion into Harlem. Word spread through organized crime networks that attempting to outbid Johnson for Harlem properties had proven unsuccessful even when competitors offered higher prices. The story of how Johnson had owned Carbone's debt and had used that ownership to control the outcome became part of the lore that circulated among criminals and business figures who navigated the boundaries between legal and illegal operations. The lesson was clear. Johnson's power in Harlem derived from complex webs of financial relationships that created leverage beyond what was visible in any particular transaction. For Johnson specifically, the successful acquisition of the property reinforced his position during the critical period following his release from prison. Johnson had been away from Harlem for more than a decade, and there had been questions about whether he could reestablish the control he had exercised before his incarceration. The property acquisition demonstrated that Johnson had successfully rebuilt his financial resources, his information networks, and his strategic relationships to the point where he could compete effectively for valuable assets and could outmaneuver rivals who appeared to have superior resources. And the strategic approach Johnson used in this situation illustrated broader principles about how power operates in competitive environments where multiple parties seek control over limited resources. The conventional understanding of such competition focuses on direct resources: who can pay the highest price, who has the largest organization, who can deploy the most force. But Johnson's response demonstrated that sophisticated operators identify and exploit asymmetries in information and in hidden relationships that create leverage beyond apparent resources. Carbone had entered the competition with accurate information about certain things: the property's value, the amount he was willing to pay, his syndicate's financial capacity, but with incomplete information about the broader context in which the competition was occurring. Carbone did not know that Johnson held debt that could be used to affect Carbone's ability to complete the purchase. This information asymmetry meant that Carbone's apparent advantage in bidding capacity was illusory, because the full set of constraints Carbone faced was not visible until Johnson revealed the debt ownership. Johnson's maintenance of lending relationships over many years, including relationships with intermediary lenders like Morrison, created a web of financial connections that gave Johnson visibility into other operators' vulnerabilities and gave Johnson options for acquiring leverage when needed. The assignment provision in Morrison's loan agreement, a provision that might have seemed like routine security when Morrison agreed to it, became the mechanism through which Johnson acquired Carbone's debt and gained strategic control over the property competition. This illustrates how strategic planning involves creating optionality long before specific situations arise where those options might be needed. Johnson did not lend money to Morrison specifically anticipating that Morrison's loan to Carbone would become relevant to a property competition. Rather, Johnson maintained multiple lending relationships as part of general practice, understanding that such relationships created possibilities for future leverage even when specific applications could not be predicted. When the property competition emerged and Johnson learned about Carbone's debt to Morrison, Johnson had the existing relationship structure in place to convert that information into actionable leverage. The restructured debt terms Johnson offered to Carbone illustrated another principle about sophisticated use of power. Maximum leverage is often exercised through moderation rather than through extreme demands. Johnson could have demanded immediate full payment of Carbone's debt, knowing that Carbone could not pay and that the default would justify aggressive enforcement action. But doing so would have created a crisis that might have led to violence or to extended conflict that would be costly for both parties. Instead, Johnson offered terms that were better for Carbone than the original loan agreement, while still achieving Johnson's objective of controlling the property acquisition. This approach served multiple purposes. It demonstrated that Johnson's leverage was real. Carbone withdrew from the property competition and accepted terms dictated by Johnson. But it also demonstrated that Johnson used leverage proportionally rather than maximally, which created incentives for other operators to negotiate with Johnson rather than resisting to the point of crisis. If Johnson had developed a reputation for using every advantage to destroy opponents completely, rivals would have less incentive to negotiate and would be more likely to resist even when facing serious disadvantages. By demonstrating that Johnson offered reasonable terms when his leverage was acknowledged, Johnson encouraged future opponents to settle disputes through negotiation rather than through escalation. The episode also illustrated how creditor positions create ongoing influence beyond the immediate debt collection. Even after Carbone accepted the restructured terms and began making payments, the creditor relationship meant that Johnson maintained visibility into Carbone's financial condition and maintained a claim that limited Carbone's resources and strategic options. For the 2 years it took Carbone to repay the debt, Carbone operated with the awareness that Johnson was monitoring his compliance and that default on the restructured terms would trigger enforcement action. This awareness influenced Carbone's decisions about resource allocation and about whether to pursue expansion opportunities that might strain his syndicate's finances. More broadly, the debt relationship established a power dynamic that extended beyond the specific dollars owed. Carbone had been positioned as someone who had miscalculated by challenging Johnson in Harlem, who had underestimated Johnson's capabilities, and who had been forced to accept terms dictated by someone Carbone had initially dismissed. This reputational outcome affected how Carbone was perceived within organized crime circles and how other operators assessed whether Carbone's syndicate was a reliable partner or a potential competitor. For Harlem's broader criminal economy, and the episode reinforced the understanding that Johnson's control was based on systems rather than just on individual transactions. Johnson maintained networks of relationships that gave him information about competitors, financial leverage through lending operations, legal representation that could enforce his rights, and intermediaries who could communicate his positions effectively. This systematic approach meant that challenging Johnson required more than simply having resources for a particular transaction. It required understanding and countering the multiple dimensions of Johnson's organizational capacity. The property itself became a valuable asset in Johnson's operations, generating income from gambling activities and serving as a visible symbol of Johnson's continued control over strategic locations in Harlem. And the building operated successfully for the remaining years of Johnson's life. And after Johnson's death in July 1968, the property passed to his associates who maintained gambling operations there through the early 1970s. The building's history became part of Harlem's oral tradition about how Johnson had maintained control through strategic sophistication rather than simply through violence or wealth. Eleanor Washington's role in the episode demonstrated how legal expertise served criminal operations by providing the formal mechanisms through which informal leverage could be exercised. Washington's notification letter to Carbone, her presentation of the restructured debt terms, and her management of the property transaction all involved legal processes that were entirely proper from a procedural standpoint, even though they served the interests of someone operating illegal gambling businesses. Washington's professional standing and legal knowledge made Johnson's strategic maneuvers more effective by wrapping them in formal documentation and legal authority that opponents could not easily dismiss or challenge. Thomas Chen's financial accounting similarly provided technical credibility to Johnson's debt claims. Chen's calculation of the exact amount Carbone owed, including principal and accumulated interest, created precision that made Johnson's position difficult to dispute. Carbone might have preferred to argue that the debt was approximately $12,000 rather than $12,800, but Chen's detailed accounting established the specific figure with documentation that would support Johnson's claims if enforcement became necessary. This precision mattered because it showed that Johnson operated with professional standards, rather than with rough estimates that might be negotiable. Reverend Caldwell's intermediary role illustrated how community leaders navigated the complex ethical terrain of Harlem's mixed economy where legal and illegal activities intersected. Caldwell served Harlem's community through legitimate ministry and advocacy work, but Caldwell also understood that figures like Johnson were part of Harlem's power structure and that community welfare sometimes required helping to manage disputes between criminal operators in ways that prevented violence and disruption. Caldwell's willingness to facilitate communication between Johnson and Carbone helped ensure the dispute was resolved through negotiation rather than through confrontation that might have created collateral harm to Harlem residents. When Bumpy Johnson died on July 7, 1968, obituaries and community discussions of his legacy included references to how he had maintained control of Harlem through strategic intelligence and through complex financial and social relationships rather than primarily through violence. And the property acquisition in late 1964 was remembered by people who knew the story as an example of Johnson's approach, identifying hidden leverage, using information strategically, offering terms that achieved objectives without creating unnecessary conflict, and demonstrating capabilities that deterred future challenges. The specific details of how Johnson had acquired Carbone's debt and had used that ownership to control the property competition became somewhat mythologized over time, with various versions circulating that differed in specifics while maintaining the essential narrative of Johnson outmaneuvering a rival through financial sophistication. Some versions emphasized the assignment mechanism through which Johnson acquired the debt. Others focused on the negotiation through which Carbone accepted Johnson's terms. And still others highlighted how Johnson had maintained lending relationships that created the infrastructure for such strategic maneuvers. The enduring significance of the episode related to how it illustrated principles about power that operated far beyond the specific context of illegal gambling in 1960s Harlem. The demonstration that debt ownership creates leverage over debtors' strategic choices applied in contexts ranging from international finance to neighborhood loan sharking, from corporate acquisitions to personal borrowing. Creditors could influence debtors' decisions by controlling access to resources that debtors needed, by threatening enforcement that would disrupt debtors' operations, or by offering better terms in exchange for debtors' compliance with creditors' preferences. And the episode also illustrated how information asymmetry, knowing things about opponents that they do not know you know, creates opportunities for strategic surprise that can overcome apparent disadvantages in direct resources. Carbone had entered the property competition believing he understood the relevant factors: his higher bid, his syndicate's financial capacity, Johnson's recent release from prison. Carbone did not know that Johnson held leverage through debt ownership that could affect the outcome regardless of the bid amounts. When Johnson revealed this hidden factor, Carbone's understanding of the competitive situation had to be revised fundamentally, leading to acceptance that Johnson controlled the outcome through means Carbone had not anticipated. Most profoundly, and the episode demonstrated that sophisticated power operates through relationships and systems rather than through simple dominance or resource accumulation. Johnson's power to acquire the property, despite offering less money than Carbone, came from Johnson's network of financial relationships, from his access to information about competitors, from his legal and accounting infrastructure that could formalize and enforce his claims, and from his strategic judgment about when to exercise leverage and when to offer accommodation. This systemic power was more durable and more difficult to challenge than power based solely on having the most money or the largest organization. The quiet resolution of the property competition, Carbone's withdrawal, Johnson's acquisition, at the restructured debt repayment that proceeded without incident reflected the mature understanding both parties developed about how power operated in their relationship. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public humiliation of Carbone, no violence or threats beyond the implicit understanding that debt collection could become aggressive if negotiation failed. Carbone withdrew from competition for a property he could not acquire given Johnson's leverage, accepted more favorable debt terms than he would have received without the negotiation, and continued operating his Brooklyn Syndicate successfully. Johnson acquired the property he sought at the price he believed it was worth, demonstrated his continued control of Harlem's strategic resources, and established a creditor relationship with a Brooklyn syndicate that created ongoing influence and deterred future encroachment. The efficiency and minimal conflict of this resolution showed that both parties understood power dynamics clearly and chose pragmatic accommodation over costly resistance. The story of how a rival syndicate tried to outbid Bumpy Johnson, only to discover that Johnson owned their debt, became a reference point for understanding how financial leverage operates as a form of power, how hidden information creates strategic advantages, and how sophisticated operators convert apparent disadvantages into controlling positions. The lesson that creditor positions grant influence beyond simple debt collection influenced how subsequent generations of criminals and business operators thought about lending relationships and about the strategic value of information about others' financial vulnerabilities. In the years following Johnson's death, as scholars and journalists documented Harlem's history and examined the criminal enterprises that had operated there, the 1964 property acquisition stood as an example of Johnson's strategic sophistication. The episode illustrated that Johnson's decades-long control of Harlem was based on organizational capacity and strategic thinking that extended well beyond the violence and intimidation that characterized less sophisticated criminal operators. Johnson understood that power came from knowing what others owed, but from maintaining relationships that created leverage, and from using that leverage carefully to achieve objectives without destroying the relationships that might be valuable in the future. The property on Lenox Avenue and 132nd Street continued operating as a gambling establishment until changes in law enforcement priorities and in Harlem's economy during the 1970s made such operations less viable. The building was eventually sold and converted to other uses, its history known primarily to people who remembered the era when Johnson controlled Harlem's criminal economy and who understood how that control had been exercised through financial sophistication as much as through traditional criminal force. The story of its acquisition remained part of Harlem's collective memory, about how power actually operated beneath the surface of public transactions and apparent competition.